In this video, we're going to be looking at the multiplication principle, which is listed here on the screen. So suppose n choices are going to be made with m1 ways to make choice 1 through mn ways to make choice n. Then there are m1 times m2 all the way through mn different ways to make the entire sequence of choices. Now, that's kind of a confusing way to say something that's actually a pretty easy concept. So let's use this lock to demonstrate what this concept means. So let's say that we find this lock after years of not using it, and we can't remember what the combination is. Now we can go through and guess by flipping it through every combination that's possible, and that might take a while, but let's figure out how many different possibilities that would be. So we've got 3 different numbers, so I'm going to draw 3 different blanks. And each wheel has on it the numbers 0 through 9, which means there are 10 numbers on each wheel of this lock, which means that for the first number, there are 10 different choices for the number. For the second dial, there are again 10 choices, and then for the third dial, there are again 10 choices. So to figure out the total number of locks that are possible, lock combinations that are possible, we would just multiply these numbers together to get that there are 1,000 possible lock combinations for this lock, which makes sense because if the 3 numbers line up to make a 3-digit number, that number is going to be somewhere between 0, 0, 0 and 9, 9, 9, and so of course there would be 1,000 different combinations. Let's look at another couple examples using zip codes. So how many 5-digit zip codes are possible? So if we think about it in the same way, we've got 5 lines, and each number of the zip code could be any one of the 10 digits, 0 through 9. So there are 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 different zip codes that are possible. So that gives us 100,000 total 5-digit zip codes that could be used. But what if we had some sort of a stipulation? How many 5-digit zip codes do not contain a repeated number? So in this case, we've still got our 5 blanks. And for the first blank, we still have 10 choices. But if we're not going to repeat a number, then whatever number we chose for the first spot, we cannot use in the second spot. So that means for the second spot, we only have 9 choices. And then for the third spot, we can't use either of those numbers, which means we're down to 8 choices. And then for the fourth spot, we can't use any of those 3, so we're down to 7. And then, of course, 6. So if we are trying to figure out how many 5-digit zip codes do not contain a repeated number, we'd multiply these 5 numbers together. And we would get that there are 30,240 different zip codes that do not contain any repeated numbers. All right, how many 5-digit zip codes start and end with a 0? So again, we're looking at 5 blanks. And we want to know how many different zip codes start and end with a 0. So if the first digit has to be a 0, that means there's only one choice. For the last number, we also want a 0, which means we only have one choice there as well. And then there's nothing mentioned about repeated numbers. If nothing is mentioned about repeated numbers, then we assume that numbers can be repeated, which means that there are 10 choices for the second number, 10 choices for the third number, and 10 choices for the fourth number, and then we'd multiply all these together. And we would get that there are 1,000 different possibilities. And lastly, how many 5-digit zip codes start with a 0 and do not contain a repeated number? Alright, so let's draw our 5 blanks. Now it has to start with a 0, so we only have one choice there. We know that one's a 0. Now this second box can be any number except 0, because we already used a 0 in that first spot, which means that here we've only got 9 choices. The third spot, it can't be either of the first 2 numbers, so that's 8, and then 7 and 6. And so again, we would multiply all of these together, and get that in total there would be 3,024 different zip codes that do not, or that contain, start with a 0 and do not contain a repeated number.